Welcome to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Academy. I'm Graham Richmond and I'm with Alex Brown for this lesson on interviews. It's our second lesson, Alex, on interviews, and this one's going to be about the types of interviews that schools deploy as they assess candidates. First thing though, before we get into the names of these different types, I wanted to kind of propose a framework around thinking of it through what the interviewer knows about you, right? Because they're all different variations there. So tell me about, there are basically three ways, right? So what are they?
So there's what we call the resume-based interview. And the idea here is the interviewer doesn't know anything about you other than you've been invited to interview. So obviously they know that.
Right.
And all they know about you is the resume that you bring to the interview. So that's actually a really important document for them because they can use that as a launch pad for the questions that they ask.
Or in some cases, like you might have to email them the resume a day or two prior. But that's all they have.
Yeah.
They don't have your application.
Yeah, exactly. So why do some schools adopt this approach? What they're basically doing is saying, all right, the essays is one sort of independent medium where you told your stories. We're going to use the interview as another independent medium that you're going to tell your stories so they can look for consistencies and just make sure everything sort of resonates across your entire application. So when you talk about stuff in your interview, you shouldn't worry that you've already addressed that in your essays. The answers to your questions in the interview should be your best stories and your best answers, regardless of what you did in the rest of the application. That's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You're wanting to impress the interviewer, right? The interviewer is going to write the report, so you've got to use your best stories, and they're fair game whether you use them or not in your prior piece of the application.
And I think there's an element of this, what we would call a blind interview, the resume-based interview, that is also about not wanting to bias the interviewer in any way.
Right.
So the interviewer, in theory, doesn't know like your test score or anything else, your GPA, that might bias them, unless you happen to have that stuff on your resume, right? But so it's sort of another independent viewpoint. I guess on the other end of the spectrum, though, there's another way that schools do it, and that's what we would call an application-based interview. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, but just back to that point, if you've got a poor test score, don't include it on your resume. Let's just keep it at that.
Yeah.
Very good. So so the other end of the spectrum is the application-based interview. So this three schools that come to mind that do this is Harvard and Stern and Sloan. And frankly, I think this is the right way that schools interview, not to demonize every other top school on the planet, but this is more of an additive approach.
Right. So
the interviewer has read your application, understands your sort of your stories and your what you've written and has a good sense of who you are, and based on your application materials has come up with some questions. So they might ask some sort of general questions like why MBA, just to sort of verify some of this, what you've talked about in your application, but they might really go do a deep dive on one aspect of your candidacy that they identified in your application that they want to learn more about specifically. And there might be a myriad reasons why they want to do that, but it's an opportunity for them to probe deeply. So the resume-based interview is sort of an opportunity to have another independent assessment of the candidacy as it is, whereas the application-based interview is an opportunity for a school to dive more deeply into that candidacy.
Right, and then we have this third path, which is a hybrid, right, where there are some schools where the interviewer may get just your data forms, but not your essays or your reference letters. And so there are some kind of in-between paths. But you're right. I think the most common are the kind of blind resume-based interview and then the application-based interview. Those are the two.
Yeah, and I would bucket the hybrid into the resume-based because basically whether it's resume-based or resume and application data form-based, it's a reasonably similar approach. They're going to ask you a similar set of questions.
Right. Now, folks watching this or listening to us might be wondering like, well, okay, so there's different interview types. What's the big deal? But I think one of the main things is if you go into a resume-based interview, you need to sort of, it's almost like you're resetting the clock.
Exactly.
And you're starting over. So you have to ignore the fact that you poured your heart and soul into hours and hours and hours of application materials that you sent to that school. And then that school asks you to interview, and the person sitting in front of you knows nothing, right? Except they have the resume. So you have to remember to reset and be very willing to kind of start from the beginning and tell them the story, right? Whereas on the other hand, if you go into the application-based interview and start to tell the exact same stories that you have in your essays, that's not going to cut it, because they're interviewing you looking for more usually. And as you say, doing a deep probe somewhere, they need more information.
Yeah.
So you got to know, just as you need to know who's interviewing you, you need to know what kind of interview they're conducting.
Yeah.
So beyond that, though, there are some general interview types, right? So we have what we could call a general fit interview. And again, those tend to be the resume-based blind interview where the person, just seeks to get to know you and understand what, we get into this in another lesson, but some of the, why do you want an MBA? What have you done with your career? Where are you going next kind of stuff. So that's this sort of general fit interview. You also have what you've described as the application probe, sort of the Harvard or Stern or any school that knows your file inside and out. And I can still recall, I interviewed the director of admissions at Harvard not so long ago, and he was talking about how he literally spends like at least half an hour reading the file of the candidate before the interview takes place. So they've done their due diligence, and you're going to walk into a very in-depth discussion.
And not only are they reading the file that you presented, they're also reading the commentary from the admissions readers and their assessments.
Right, and so they're going to therefore have a set of questions or concerns that they're going to want to probe around. And then there's another thing, and I think some schools mix this up, but we hear a lot about behavioral interviews. Do you want to share anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a little bit of a different approach because I think most schools now that do these sort of form fit interviews are also doing behavioral interviews, and it's a mix of the two. Sloan was the sort of first school to pioneer this notion of behavioral interviews and really asking sort of how you thought and felt, when you undertook a project, what you learned from it and all that sort of whys and the wherefores. And that stuff's really important. And if you could tell me a school that doesn't do some components of their interview from a behavioural perspective, I'd like to figure out what they do anymore, because I think they're all mixing it up in that regard a little bit. Yeah,
and I definitely think that there are always going to be questions nowadays that involve, like you said, the school asking you what you thought, felt, said, did.
Yeah.
And that's all behavioural.
Yeah.
And many people get a little flustered because there's almost a peeling of the onion that happens where they ask you one question about the project and you think you've shared the anecdote, and then they say, well, how were you feeling when this happened? And you say, well, okay, I thought I already talked about this, but then they want to go a layer deeper. Yeah. So that's the behavioral, and you need to be prepared for that. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that some schools conduct team-based interviews or interviews with multiple candidates in the room at once. Wharton is most famous for this. They have something called the team-based discussion, but I know that our friends over at IMD in Switzerland would be quick to remind us that they were first to have a team-based interview. And Ross at Michigan has done in the past. They may in the future as well, these sort of team interviews. And so do you want to talk about those? I mean, those are kind of wild to me. I mean, it's a whole other thing.
Yeah, I mean, team-based interviews obviously is a very different dynamic. Let's take the example of Wharton's team-based interview. They'll give you a scenario. You'll be interviewing with 4 or 5 other Wharton folks that were invited to interview. And you're basically given the scenario, and you have to work as a team to sort that scenario out and come up with a solution or whatever it might be. And you'll be assessed on your sort of team and communication skills and how you organise and how you contributed and so on and so forth. So there's an assessment based on how you would essentially be on a learning team at the Wharton School. That's sort of what it's trying to mimic. That said, you will also have the opportunity to do a 15-minute, 10-minute sort of one-to-one interview with one of the observers of that team-based interview. And in that case, they'll go after two things. They'll ask you the why Wharton, why MBA, let you articulate that and the fit piece. But they might also ask you about the team-based experience and sort of what your perspective was going through that process. But yeah, IMD started, Wharton's gone down that route. Ross went down it, abandoned it. Maybe they'll go back because obviously the pandemic sort of disrupted that. But we haven't seen a snowball effect yet, which I'm quite glad about, quite honestly. But don't tell everybody. I'm not a huge fan of this process.
It is challenging to be in a room with people who are all competing.
You're competing for the same spots.
Yeah, and I think knowing that, and also, in most cases, you're given information in advance about what you're going to be, what the challenge is that you need to solve as a team. So everyone comes in with a point of view, and you've got to reconcile those point of views. So it's a whole different challenge to interview in that way. But again, just there are these different types of interviews out there, and just as it's important to know who's going to interview you, you need to know how they're going to interview you.
Exactly.
Because it would be really foolish to make it this far in the process and then stumble on the interview, right? Yeah. So really important stuff. Up next, we're going to do another lesson on interviewing, and we're going to get into common questions that you're asked in an MBA admissions interview.